Who actually pays when a nation buys a high-speed future it cannot yet afford? That is the question at the heart of the Vientiane Corridor, and the answer, buried in collateral agreements signed in Beijing, is more unsettling than most observers expect. The ticket was partly paid for by pledging the revenues of 4 mines carved out of Laos soil. Act 1. Who owns Laos? A sleek train now cuts through mountains that isolated Laos for centuries. The platform at Vientiane station is pristine. The departure boards count down in Lao and Mandarin. But what lies beneath the surface of this infrastructure tells a different story entirely. Who actually pays when a nation buys a high-speed future it cannot yet afford? The 1,035-kilometer Kunming to Vientiane electrified railway opened in December 2021. The price tag was $5.9 billion. That figure represented more than 36% of Laos's entire 2024 GDP of $16.1 billion. This is not just a story about concrete and steel. It is a lesson in how a small state can trade its domestic autonomy for a capital-intensive transit zone. Act 2. The agreement they could not refuse. To understand how Vientiane arrived here, go back to late 2015, when the Intergovernmental Railway Framework Agreement was signed. Before a single shovel broke ground, the structural warning lights were already flashing. The country's public external debt had already climbed to 51.7% of GDP, above sustainable policy thresholds. The sovereign debt distress risk had been reclassified from moderate to high. That means the government's ability to fund schools, rural clinics, and road maintenance was already under pressure. Yet the corridor was too tempting to walk away from. To fund its required equity share of $730 million, Vientiane turned to the Export-Import Bank of China. In September 2016, the bank extended a loan of $480 million at 2.3% over 25 years, with a 5-year grace period. But the Export-Import Bank of China does not lend $500 million to a high-risk frontier state without ironclad assurances. The collateral was not abstract. It was carved from the ground, secured by the future revenues of 1 bauxite mine and 3 potash mines. The corporate structure of the operating entity, the Lao China Railway Company, reflects this imbalance directly. Chinese state-owned enterprises hold a 70% majority stake. The Lao National Railway holds 30%, a minority voice in its own defining asset. Along the 422-kilometer Lao segment, the joint venture controls an exclusive 50-meter developmental right-of-way on each side of the track. The host nation holds a minority share in the infrastructure crossing its own territory. Act 3. Following the money. Follow the incentives and the illusion of smooth operations gives way to something more complicated. On paper, the railway looks active. By the end of 2024, the line had carried more than 43 million passenger journeys and moved 48.3 million tons of goods. Cross-border cargo trade value reached approximately $2.3 billion in the first 11 months of 2024 alone. But here is where it gets interesting. Trade value moved is not the same as revenue earned. The actual operating revenues generated for debt service remain entirely unpublished. In a joint venture where the majority partner controls the books, the absence of a profit and loss statement is a structural feature, not a reporting gap. What can be inferred is a deep cash flow mismatch between the debt Vientiane signed and the revenues it can actually claim. Laos has avoided a formal sovereign default not through commercial viability, but through a series of quiet bilateral life support measures. Between 2020 and 2023, the Export-Import Bank of China granted $1.892 billion in emergency debt service deferrals. For ordinary Lao households, this breathing room was invisible. The government kept the lights on in ministries, but the underlying debt kept compounding. This was supplemented by a 6 billion renminbi currency swap with the People's Bank of China to ease liquidity. Deferrals are not forgiveness. They are an expensive postponement. By 2023, total public debt had reached more than 112% of GDP, equating to $17 billion. At the center of this sits the state power utility, Électricité du Laos. That entity alone carries $5.4 billion in debt, a staggering 40% of total national debt. Électricité du Laos had aimed to become the undisputed battery of Southeast Asia, monetizing 11,600 megawatts of hydropower capacity. Instead, it found itself paralyzed by sovereign-linked liabilities it could not service. The electricity powering a household fan in Vientiane was being kept on by borrowed time. Act 4. When the Kip Collapsed. When a state's balance sheet strains under hard currency obligations, the pain flows downhill until it strikes the ordinary citizen. For Laos, that transmission mechanism was the currency market. Relentless demands to service foreign currency debt triggered an 88.5% depreciation of the Lao Kip against the US dollar between 2022 and 2024. Because foreign goods make up roughly 50% of Laos's GDP, the plunging Kip fed instantly into local markets. Annual fuel import costs alone surpassed $1 billion by 2025. Peak consumer inflation hit 31.23% in 2023. Think about what that means for a farming family in the northern Udomsai province, rising before dawn to tend cassava and rubber plots. These households produce export crops that should theoretically benefit from a weaker currency. Instead, soaring costs for imported agricultural inputs and diesel erased the savings they had spent years building. The ultimate consequence was not a standard default, it was a quiet realignment of national infrastructure ownership. To address the compounding insolvency of its state utility, Vientiane relinquished majority control of its national power transmission grid to China Southern Power Grid in an emergency debt equity concession. If economic management fails to reform, the consequences deepen. Delays in customs reform could cause regional shipping to bypass the railway entirely due to border bottlenecks, depressing transit revenues. If the Export-Import Bank of China halts its debt deferrals, the sovereign balance sheet slides into formal distress. Acute foreign exchange shortages would trigger fuel rationing, halting inland transport networks. Truck drivers in Vientiane, unable to work, would struggle to afford basic food amid unyielding inflation. An optimistic path exists, but it requires institutional change. Full implementation of World Trade Organization trade facilitation reforms could reduce trans-border freight transit from 3 days to under 3 hours. Expanded railway traffic would generate healthier cash flows and eliminate the parallel market currency premium. A cassava farmer in Luang Prabang, who currently sells at whatever price a middleman offers because she has no reliable export route, could secure a direct regional contract, build savings, and clear her debts within a single growing season. Act 5. What the rest of ASEAN is watching. The unfolding reality of the Vientiane Corridor has exposed a stark divide among the global institutions watching the region. The International Monetary Fund, applying an optimistic model, projects public debt will fall to 56.2% of GDP by 2030. That projection assumes sustained railway revenue growth not yet evidenced in any published account. Regional development banks project the opposite, public debt climbing to 126.7% by 2029, weighting the structural cash flow mismatch more heavily. A near 70 percentage point gap between projections. The same country, entirely different futures. This divergence stands in sharp contrast to Laos's regional peers. Cambodia runs a highly dollarized economy that insulates its domestic retail prices from currency shocks in a way the Kip never could. Vietnam carries far stronger per capita income, $4,018 against Laos's 1,970, and its external debt is manageable. But Vietnam has its own quiet pressure point. A banking sector still digesting a real estate correction, and foreign exchange reserves that multilateral institutions describe as adequate but not comfortable, sitting at around 2.4 months of import cover. Then there is Myanmar. The data is too impaired to draw firm conclusions. Post-coup disruption has broken the statistical pipeline entirely. Laos sits exposed where its neighbors are insulated. Public and publicly guaranteed debt at 94% of GDP, foreign exchange reserves at 4.2 months of import cover, directly in the path of any global commodity shock with very little buffer to absorb it. This divergence stands in sharp contrast to Laos's regional peers. Cambodia has used a highly dollarized economy to partially insulate domestic retail prices from currency shocks. Vietnam carries stronger per capita income and manageable external debt, but its banking sector is still digesting a real estate correction, and its foreign exchange reserves are what multilateral institutions describe as adequate but not comfortable at around 2.4 months of import cover. Laos, with 4.2 months of import cover and public plus publicly guaranteed debt at 94% of GDP, sits directly exposed to global commodity volatility in a way its neighbors are not. The structural trade-off made along the Mekong reveals a new pattern for development in the region. The Laos state has pioneered a model where infrastructure is built by pledging subsoil wealth and conceding management of national grids. The trains still run, connecting distant production centers to regional markets. The power transmission grid has already changed hands. The mines are already collateral. The question the rest of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is watching, quietly and carefully, is not whether this model worked for Laos. It is whether the next country in line will read the contract more carefully before signing. I am Hero the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN Angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.